Hello and welcome to My Safety Hub, your go-to source for all things health and safety. My name's Dylan Steyn and thank you for joining us for another Studio Hazard Spotlight. I'm joined here today again by none other than Ockert Fourie. Ockert, I trust you are in good health and you had a good week behind you. We have had some very fruitful conversation and some very interesting questions being thrown our way, and today is no different. What is your expectation like for today's session?
Well, I think today is going to be an interesting conversation based on one of the questions that we've received, which I'm going to pose to you now.
Mm-hmm.
And that question is, what is the difference between a hazard and a risk?
That is a very interesting question. The viewers out there are really coming up with some good questions. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment. So Ockert, coming back to your question, what is the difference between a hazard and a risk?
Mm-hmm.
That is an interesting one. If we look at the formal definition of hazard, a hazard means the source of or exposure to danger. It is the physical action or the physical, how can we put this, energy required to cause harm to another. It is the starting point of something going wrong. A risk, on the other hand, is derived from that hazard. And as we've rightfully mentioned in previous videos, one hazard could have multiple risks associated to them. So, for example, if we have a slip, trip and fall hazard in the form of a cable lying on the floor, we could have multiple risks attached to that. You could potentially fall down, break your arm, potentially fall down, get a concussion, or in a worst case scenario, even fatality. Those are all associated risks with that. So the definition of a risk is the probability that injury or damage could occur. So that is the formal terminology or formal definitions, if I put it to you that way. But it seems as though you have something up your sleeve with this question.
I do. So if I listen to your definitions, let's just quickly go back, first of all, to your definition on a risk. So you say it's the probability that something can cause harm. So you're looking at chance versus the result or the outcome or the consequence, right? Now, if I had to ask you, going back to your definition of a hazard, and you say it's the source of harm. So let's just explore that that definition or phrase. So what is a source of harm?
It is any type of equipment or any energy source that would be required to cause harm, I suppose. It is something that in its static form doesn't pose significant danger, but if it comes into contact with certain elements or comes into contact with certain conditions, it could cause damage or harm.
Okay, so you used a couple of words there that I find interesting.
Sure.
So you used the word can.
Can.
Okay, so that means that something could. Therefore, you're looking at chance.
Sure.
Right, so probability. And you use the word harm. That's consequence. So isn't that the definition of risk?
A very interesting narrative there. And by definition, surely, if we look at harm, the probability that harm could occur, you are defining risk.
So is it not the same thing?
In my opinion, it definitely isn't, because one could not exist without the other. If we think about the age-old question of what came first, the chicken or the egg, the one cannot exist without the other. A risk cannot be present in the absence of a hazard. There needs to be an item, an energy source, any action perhaps with the potential to cause damage. If there's nothing with the potential to cause damage or injury, the subsequent risks would not exist.
So then why do we split the two? Why do we define hazard separate from risk?
I think the reason we define hazards separately from risk is when we talk about hazard and risk mitigation and control measures that we spoke very extensively about in our previous videos, we are looking for a singular component to eliminate. If we purely focus on eliminating risks, you might be able to eliminate a few risks out of the various branches, but does that eliminate the source of that risk? Not necessarily. So the reason we differentiate between the two is the hazard becomes very specific. For example, a slip, trip and fall hazard that I've mentioned is the cable lying on the floor. In essence, if we put appropriate control measures in place to mitigate that specific hazard, like elimination, removing the cable from the floor, all subsequent risks will then be eliminated.
So then why do we call it risk mitigation or risk management if we're focusing on the hazard?
And not hazard mitigation.
Yes. I mean, if we're focusing on the source of harm, like you've explained it well now, why do we call it risk mitigation? It just doesn't make sense.
I think the reason we call it risk mitigation, we spoke about different terminologies and how we associate definitions with different terminologies. But in essence, in common terms, if you and I talk to clients and we talk to common folk with regards to risks and hazards and health and safety conversations, we speak about risk mitigation. And the reason I think for that is, in a proper working environment, the hazards that are present there are of such a nature they cannot be eliminated completely. I gave a very mundane example, a very easy one, that you remove the cable from the floor, and that eliminates the hazard. But in reality, if we look at workplaces and the hazards and risks associated in formal workplaces, it's kind of impossible to eliminate all hazards. And therefore, the focus lies then more so on the risks associated with those hazards, and therefore risk mitigation. Because with control measures implemented for specific hazards, we can't remove the hazard, but we can surely minimize the exposure to specific risks within that hazard. Hence again, the definition risk mitigation.
Right, so I agree that it's impossible to eliminate all hazards from the workplace, because without them the work won't happen. Do we then control risk, or do we control the hazard?
In essence, the idea behind risk management or risk mitigation is to fundamentally control the hazard. Because if we can control the hazard effectively, again, the subsequent risks attached to that hazard would become less and less and less with the different layers of control that we put in place.
All right, so would you then say that we define the risks associated to a hazard purely for the sake of being clear on what the dangers are associated to the hazard, so that we are clear on what it is that we would need to do, or what the possibilities could be in terms of these negative outcomes? So you're looking at financial risk, you're looking at risk with regards to your brand and the negative association to your brand. You're looking at physical risk, persons that can get injured. You're looking at risk associated to the environment. If we're saying that we're controlling the hazard, and we then define all of these risks, but we're focusing on the hazard in our risk mitigation process, do we then define these risks, focus on these various elements for the purpose of only understanding what these possible consequences could be? Or is the focus purely on the hazard, knowing that there's a source of harm? So is it too much to say that if we eliminate all of these definitions of risk and we purely focus on the source of harm, do we still have to define all of these things? Because if we understand that there's a source of harm and there's a source of danger, why do we have all of these definitions on risk then? It just doesn't make sense. Are we not going too far with this?
Yeah, a very good question and a very valid statement you put in there as well. And again, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? But in reality, we need to define risk clearly, up and above the hazard that we've already spoken about now. We understand now that the hazard is the source of the danger, and if we are able to eliminate the hazard, all subsequent risks will be mitigated as well, or removed in that matter. But coming back to the question being raised, are we not going into too much detail? And the answer is no. It is important for us from a risk management perspective that we define the risks associated with the hazard clearly. Why? Because various different things can potentially happen, not just one singular thing. Let me put it into perspective for you. If we break down a task, there are certain things that happen within a task that can potentially lead to an accident or an incident for that matter. So let's take a task, for example, walking in a walkway. Let's stick to the theme of the cable in the floor, right? If a person conducts walking in a walkway to do whatever task he might do, deliver files or whatever the case might be, walking is a task on its own or an activity. Within that activity, we have various hazards present, such as the cable lying on the floor. Now, in between your accident, incident, and this task, we have something called an unsafe act or an unsafe condition. Your task is now leading up for you to commit an unsafe act because you see the cable and you think, nah, nothing bad is going to happen. So you knowingly do something you're not supposed to do, and that would be to just simply walk over the cable and not address the issue. But in committing that unsafe act, what then happens is what we call an undesired event. That undesired event is now where this starts linking back to the hazard. You now make contact with the hazard. That's that energy I spoke about. You are now physically interacting with that energy or potential energy source, which in turn results in that undesired event. The undesired event making contact with our hazard, resulting in an action. That undesired event then moves into a physical action of tripping. Now, in that moment where your foot gets caught in the cable and you start to trip, our undesired event, now one of two things can happen. You can either fall down, break your arm, or you can fumble a bit, but you don't fall down. Accident, incident. Coming back to your question, that undesired event now needs to be transcribed into clearly defined risks with associated damages to them.
The consequences.
The consequences. Because now I can trip, I could fall, or I couldn't fall. I could fall, break my arm, I could fall and just dust myself off, I could fall and die. So in order for us to manage risk effectively, we need to take those into consideration, because if we look at the most severe, which is falling or tripping, falling down and dying, we need to look at the controls associated with that, as opposed to just the hazard, the cable. Oh, well, just remove the cable or just, cover the cable. If we do not look at all the potential risks associated with that specific hazard, we might overlook control measures. And that is the most important part of this whole process. So if it's not clearly defined, we are setting ourselves up for failure when identifying different control measures.
Right, so what you're saying is that you have the risk descriptions or definitions associated to the hazard so that you would be able to identify sufficient controls for them.
Sure.
So if I had a risk statement or definition associated to a hazard, and I say, for example, a person makes contact with, let's say a live electrical wire or exposed electrical wire resulting in, and then I start listing consequences. So I can have second-degree burns, third-degree burns. The person can go unconscious due to the electric shock. They can fall and get into a coma. They can develop chronic disease, epilepsy, due to the electric shock.
Sure.
And they can die. How do I associate control measures to a statement like that? I mean, how do these consequences help me decide on control measures to be assigned?
Sure, and that's where the other side of this linking process takes place. Now that we understand the hazard, the undesired event, and the risk that results in accidents and incidents, and now coming to the control measures and to why it's important to define this. Remember, we want to control the hazard. But the important bit of the risk descriptions is because it gives us clarity on the severity and probability that something could occur from that particular hazard. When we look at the risk assessment methodology, it is important to list these consequences, because based off of these consequences, as we spoke in our risk assessment methodology video, you have two different types of scoring. So if we don't have these definitions, we can say, oh, a cable lying on the floor, that's a low risk. But if we say there's a cable on the floor that could result in us dying, that immediately becomes a 4 on our methodology. And if we now consider that as a severity point, we also look at the probability and we say, what is the likelihood of the cable, resulting in someone dying? And we say, that's not too bad, that's maybe a 2.
Depending on how many people
obviously
that will actually walk there, how
course.
many of them would actually decide to walk over it and not to correct it. All right, so your probability is obviously affected by your exposure and the amount of exposure that you have.
Indeed,
right?
And we spoke about those items again. If you haven't watched that video, go and watch the definition of a risk assessment itself. But coming back to the point as to why the hazard descriptions are still important, we now associate scoring to the risk that is stipulated or derived from that particular hazard. And those keywords, the results, the consequences, those are the measurables in this. And if we start measuring severe things like death, disability, amputations, and so forth, suddenly that hazard is seen in a different spotlight, as opposed to just purely looking at the hazard as a standalone. So again, the one feeds the other, the chicken or the egg. We cannot have only risk or only hazard. They complement each other in that sense.
Right, so I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate now.
Normally that's my job.
So do you include the hazard in your risk statement?
You'll have to, yes.
Okay,
Because
so then on your risk assessment, why do you mention the hazard separate from your risk statement? It's in your risk statement.
Sure. The hazard is listed separately again because we try and mitigate the hazard as a collective, as a whole. However, we need to paint a clear picture when defining that risk. Again, that's where the undesired event comes into play. You list the hazard, the undesired event, the action, and then the consequences associated with that. That is the formal description of how a risk description should be written. It is again important to define that, because if we leave the hazard out of that description, we are not referring back to the actual source that causes the undesired event, in essence not referring back to the hazard itself. So it is important when we define risk, we talk about what is the hazard, what is the undesired event, what is the risk that will obviously result of that undesired event linked back to our hazard.
All right, so from a clarity perspective, then it's necessary to list your hazards. Would you say that it's important to classify them?
Definitely. We have various types of hazards and the descriptions associated with that. If we look at hazard description, there could be a multitude of different descriptions. As you say, we could have physical hazards, ergonomical hazards, electrical, chemical, fire, slip, trip and falls, even environmental and psychosocial hazards. These are all different categories that contain different sources of energy or different potentials to cause harm in our risk statement.
And then the last question that I have is, how far should you go when you define your risk? Because, I mean, you've got your hazard classification, then you've got the specific hazard in that classification. So you can have a fire hazard, and then you can have a description of what the fire hazard is.
Sure.
Which, again, leads to your risk description, where you make mention of the specific hazard again, moving towards the exposure or the unwanted event, which may result in a list of consequences. How far should I go in listing these consequences?
Again, a very good question. And when we think about how we classify and how we write risk and hazard descriptions, if we look at what is reasonably practicable, we always say to the guys in our training sessions, you need to look at everything foreseeably possible with that regard. We need to look at every single potential. And this is, again, a conversation that we had. How far is too far? How long is a piece of string? But in essence, the short answer to this is look at everything that could reasonably happen with the specific hazard and the risks associated to that hazard. Because if we are inaccurate in listing the consequences in our risk statement, again, our control measures will not be accurate with this regard. So be systematic in your approach when listing the consequences, be realistic, but also look at worst case scenarios, because we have to. If we look at proper risk mitigation, we look at controlling the worst case scenario and trying to implement controls for that. Because if we do that, in essence, we are over controlling the task, which means we have more layers of defense than are normally necessary. And that's not a bad thing.
Okay, so now I have another question. Right, so because you've now mentioned something which kind of opens a bit of a can of worms for me. In the beginning of our conversation, we said that we want to control the hazard. Right?
Sure.
I asked questions about what's the difference between risk and hazard. Why do we mention risk mitigation or risk management? And And we've now tried to define the two of them and how they are also associated to each other and how the process works together. But we've also now mentioned the list of consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And you've mentioned that the list of consequences will have a direct impact on our control measures that we select. Yes. But at the beginning, we said that we want to control the hazard. Mm-hmm. So which is it? Is it both, or is it one, or is it the other?
Again, it complements one another. And without diving into too much detail or trying to open up the can of worms too much here, the short answer is we still control the hazard. However, the risk description is necessary because that also gives us indication as to how many controls or how much controls we need to implement. Referring back to our methodology as well. Remember, when we look at a risk assessment, there is scoring involved in this process. So it's not simply controlling the one or the other. Yes, we want to control the hazard in its entirety. That is the goal. But again, it's not always possible to control the entire hazard on its own. Mm-hmm. If we then have a look at the methodology, we have consequence versus our probability. And if we look at the definition of a specific risk, I said we need to go as far as reasonably practical on the severity, death, disability, unconsciousness, etc., and score it accordingly. That in itself will again depict us what control measures need to be in place to eventually mitigate the hazard. Because again, with the risks associated to the hazard, it defines the priority of the hazard itself that we are referring to.
Okay, so in practical terms then, if I have, again, an electrical hazard, an exposed wire, and we have the unwanted event or the exposure to the hazard, and if I don't have a clear definition on my risk description or in my risk description with all of the listed consequences that are probable.
Yes.
So a person then makes contact with the live electrical wire, but my risk statement only says, for example, that he may have light burns on his hand. Mm-hmm. That can result in me not having sufficient controls, such as maybe only opting to buy a basic, very basic first aid kit.
Sure.
And not necessarily a proper first aid box.
Exactly.
With burn shield in it and all the necessary equipment to also help me with resuscitation. Mm-hmm. Whatever the case may be. So if I don't have clearly defined consequences and a clearly defined risk statement associated to the hazard, I may be leaving gaps open as well. So I focus on the hazard. Mm-hmm. So if I've got a fire hazard, electrical hazard, doesn't matter what it is, I need to try and control the danger at the source, but I need to think about the possible consequences because it can also influence my selection of controls.
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense.
So let me put this to you practically for a last example here. Let's take moving equipment or moving machinery. Now, we spoke about and we did various SOPs on forklifts, overhead cranes and so forth. The forklift in itself is a hazard. Driving through the warehouse, driving, loading bays, etc. That poses a significant hazard, which is a source of danger. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to remove the forklift from a logistics operation? No. Which means we cannot completely eliminate the hazard, which is the forklift. However, we know that there are risks associated with the forklift driving in a populated area, which could result in a person being run over, which is the unwanted event, resulting in death, disability, amputation, unconsciousness, etc. If we didn't list that, would we just say, you can just have a forklift license and off you go? Everything should be fine. However, now we see the severity of this specific hazard through the risk descriptions, which tells us that in our control selection, we need to not only look at the hazard, which is the forklift load testing, operator certificate, etc., but we also need to look at additional things such as SOP for pedestrians. We need to look at safe operating procedures for loading and offloading. We need to look at, let's say, for example, speed limiting signs or any means of traffic narrating, if I can put it that way, traffic control for that matter. So again, the one cannot exist without the other, and the more we define the risk statements, the more accurately we can control the hazard associated with that risk and ultimately with the task itself, keeping in mind that one task can have many different hazards present.
I think you've painted the picture very clearly in these final statements where you've mentioned the description of the severity. where if we don't define these consequences properly as they are connected to your methodology and should be included in the methodology as well, we would always miss the mark in terms of understanding exactly how dangerous something could be.
Exactly.
And that's where we miss the plot when it comes to the assignment of controls and the implementation of controls and policies that govern them to make sure that the work is actually controlled sufficiently.
Exactly. You know, and I think you summarized it quite well with the methodology, and that's why it's important to have a formal risk assessment methodology, because at the end of the day, when we do our scoring and we allocate our controls, there is still a level of risk associated with that particular task. And then again, we need to have adequate control mechanisms in place to mitigate those hazards and risks within the task.
All right.
Cool. Ockert, thank you very much once again. That was a very fruitful conversation. I learned a lot during this process, and I think for you, the viewers out there, we provided a bit more clarity on the difference between hazard, risk, control measures, and just how these two complement each other and how they tie in to create a better, safer, more productive working environment. And that being said, as always, stay safe, stay inspired, and until next time, take care.